Don't let your heart be consumed with hatred, because that is not the way of a Christian. Hatred is a prison that your heart lives in. And when you hate somebody, I have a secret for you. You're not hurting them. You're only hurting yourself. And hatred is the product of a feeling of dashed love, of dashed hope. But when you have a life in Christ, when you live with a sense of communion with God, then that hatred will never exist in your heart. It will be extinguished. And when you live as an example, when you take up your cross and you live as Christ lived, you will extinguish the hatred in your neighbor's heart as well. And that is the only way forward, is the only way to sanity.
He has a poor track record on fasting. He was once accused of using vulgar language, but he said the accusation was bullshit. He loves the smell of gasoline and burning oil around his motorcycles and never stops drinking Coke Zero. He hasn't learned how to walk away from a fight. He has been to hell and back more than once, bringing a few public companies along for the ride. Other clergy scoff at him. The SEC and Big Pharma try to, quote, silence him for good. But their efforts haven't had the intended effect. That's Father Emmanuel.
Growing up in Tirana, where the call to a dawn echoed from the spiraling minarets, was a powerful experience for her. Albanians were forced to convert to Islam under Ottoman rule. In 1967, under the Marxist-Leninist regime, Albania became the world's first atheist state and destroyed churches to eradicate Christianity, in a land where St. Paul once preached the gospel. Her grandfather fought as a guerrilla fighter, and her father commanded a tank brigade. When communism collapsed, there was an insurrection against the state, leading to anarchy. Albanian women are known for their resilience. It is said they are born from the barrel of a gun. As a teenager, her father was flown out of the country without notice on a military helicopter to save his life. From then on, she started sleeping with an AK-47 next to her bed. That's Presbytera Theodora.
So Cologne, proud of its attitude towards art, artists, different cultures. Germany's accepted somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million refugees. How do you realistically say, welcome to Germany, and we're all going to learn to live together? Can that be done?
It could be done, of course, but I hope that all the right-wing people will not develop. And this is, for example, a job for an artist. Maybe we should go out 100 people with Nazi uniforms and walk through the city. Maybe this kind of actions will just make the people remind on the time and what our grandfathers did wrong. We really have to take care that we don't fall back in these structures.
But we kind of are.
We are on the way. We are
here necessarily. We're well on our way.
I'm allowed to be naive. And
I honestly
talk about utopias. It's a kind of utopia. Just the fact that the whole world will mix up with each other, that in, 70, 80 years, there will be no white people anymore and only cappuccino-colored people.
Look, that's the only way. This is the only solution. This is my way of thinking.
Mix up.
It's our only hope, is our way out of this.
Yes.
It's going to take some time.
Protests have occurred in England and Northern Ireland since July 30th, 2024. They followed a mass stabbing in Southport on July 29, in which 3 children were killed. The riots have involved attacks, arson and looting and have been the worst disorder in the United Kingdom since the 2011 England riots. The protesters have been opposed by counter-protesters, which has led to violent clashes between opposing groups. Commentators and mainstream media have suggested the protests are racially motivated by far-right and anti-immigration elements and fueled by Islamophobia within the UK. What are your thoughts?
What are my thoughts? I think technocrats control the narrative. They love to attach the word Islamophobic to everything, but the reality is that these are British patriots. They know that they're losing something, but it's wrong if they blame the immigrant population. To be sure, there is something wrong with an immigrant population which shows up and seeks to displace the existing native culture and religion, as we see in the UK. But it would never happen if the British people and the rest of the Europeans actually loved their cultural heritage, their history, and above all, their Christian identity. The reality is Europe has become so secular, the UK has become so incredibly secular that they've turned their back on Christ, they've turned their back on the church. And the result is that you have persistent agnostics, you have atheists, and you have apostates. And let me tell you, a people that doesn't understand their own roots is like a tree without roots. It's a dead tree. For a people that don't understand their cultural heritage, that don't understand their religious heritage, they too are also a dead people. And it is wrong to blame the Muslim population, the immigrant population. Do they commit crimes? Of course they do, but they didn't invent crime. It's not like they showed up and the British were a bunch of altar boys and they never committed crime. Crime exists because humanity has fallen. But the fact of the matter is the country is being overtaken by the immigrant population because the country itself ceased to have its own identity. It actually hates itself. And it's not unique just to the UK. It exists all over Europe. Look at the rise of atheism and look at the rise of persistent agnosticism along with euthanasia. Look at the Netherlands, for example, where they euthanize young people at the slightest mental perturbance, if they're feeling depressed or stressed or something like that. Look what's going to happen in Switzerland soon. They're going to have their suicide sarcopods where people can check out for as little as $20. How many Muslims do you think are going to be lining up to jump into one of those sarcopods? When you see a European person walking with a stroller, you say, this is great, a family. It's so rare, the population is aging, that finally I see someone with a child, and you walk up, and you know what they have in the stroller? They have a dog in the stroller because they've humanized their pets. But when you see a Muslim family walking on the street with a stroller, it's a child in that stroller. And that's because the Muslim population, which is considerably younger than the median age of the European population, including in the UK, are actually producing. They're actually procreating. They love family, and they're producing offspring at a rate about 30% greater than a native European population. We should ask ourselves why, and I'll tell you why. It's a combination, it's a cocktail of hedonism and narcissism, of self-love. And what does that lead to? It doesn't lead to life. It doesn't lead to the creation of life. It doesn't lead to agency and new life. It leads to death. And if there's any more proof you need of that, look at the growth in the statistics of euthanasia. That does not exist amongst the immigrant population. So I would tell the British people, don't hate your neighbor, don't hate your Muslim neighbors. They bleed just like you, they're human just like you. If there's great discord and there's strife and there's anger and there's hatred and there's all this passion in the streets, these people, it's because they're like you, and so far as they have hopes and they have dreams and they have passion. And some of them are criminals, yes, just like some part of the British population are also criminals. That is a human condition. But if you really loved your country, you wouldn't be turning your churches into hotels. You wouldn't be turning them into pubs if it was no big deal. And you would not be allowing the Islamization of your country. You would react differently to your Islamic brothers and sisters. If you knew Christ in your heart, you would treat them with compassion, and you would take up your cross as Christ did. And then you would recover your culture. You would recover the great, magnificent British culture and society, which influenced virtually the entire Western world at some point, and which now has been relegated to this small little island of almost inconsequential. And if we're not careful, really, the UK will become truly the first Islamic country in Europe, let's say after perhaps Albania, that is actually a nuclear power. But it won't be because the immigrants did something that was so terribly wrong. It's because you didn't love your own country. So I would say, do not carry out this hatred. Be at peace. Show love and forgiveness and understanding to your neighbor who's probably working just as hard as you are. And if you want to really know where the source of the strife is, it's not from the immigrant population. It's from powers which are greater than you and greater than them, which want this conflict between Christians and Muslims. Christianity and Islam have existed for 14 centuries. It has interacted very closely from time to time. There was an Ottoman Empire which covered parts of Europe. There's nothing new under the sun. It's not as if suddenly, for the first time, Islam is encountering Christianity. But you have to ask yourself, why has this country become so ethnically diverse? Why has it been maybe forcefully pushed into insisting on a sort of what could be called diversity, equity, inclusion? In fact, of course, it's anything but that, right? It's the opposite of that. God made people different, insisting that they live together and they become some sort of shade of gray is never going to happen, and it certainly isn't diversity. But ask yourself, what are the powers that are insisting that take place in Western Europe and especially in the UK? And what is it that's really causing the unraveling of the fabric of society? Those are the real questions to ask. If you fight each other, I'm afraid that everybody's losing.
White. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The head of the Law Society, white. The head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every prison governor, white. And not just justice, the Chief Medical Officer, white. The Chief Nursing Officer, white. The Chief Veterinary Officer, white. The Chief Social Work Advisor, white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white.
The political leadership in the UK has suggested that the riots have been fueled by disinformation and also promoted the theory that the unrest is linked to Islamophobic, racist, and anti-immigrant sentiments spread online, including on the social media platform X by far-right groups. On August 4th, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer said that rioters, quote, will feel the full force of the law, and told them, you will regret taking part in this, whether directly or those whipping up this action online and then running away themselves. He added, quote, I won't shy away from calling it what it is, far-right thuggery. On August 8, 2024, the UK government appeared to threaten the population when it posted on X, quote, think before you post, with the Crown Prosecution Service announcing the criminalization of social media content that it deemed to, quote, inciting criminal behavior. Some have suggested that, quote, civil war is inevitable in the UK and claimed that conservative protesters were treated more harshly than pro-immigration counter-protesters. The former First Minister of Scotland, Humza Yousaf, went as far as to call ex-owner Elon Musk a, quote, dangerous race baiter and one of the most dangerous men on the planet. What is going on in the UK?
Yousaf is a clanging cymbal. There's nothing more deceptive than an obvious fact. Scotland is 93% white and overwhelmingly Christian in its heritage. Notwithstanding that, they took this man who is the son of Punjabi, Muslim, Pakistani immigrants and allowed him to have an extraordinary career. They allowed him to have an extraordinary political career, and yet he seems to hate white people. I'm afraid in this case, Elon Musk is exactly right. He's more or less hit the nail on the head. It's really quite remarkable that this man his parents come from one of the least diverse countries in the world. There's 235 million people in Pakistan, and the percentage of that population that's actually white is so small that it's immeasurable. And it's a country which actively persecutes, sometimes with the assistance and certainly the blessing of the government, Christians. Yet he doesn't seem to have a problem with it, and it represents 3.5 times the population of the 66 million people in the United Kingdom. This is ridiculous, this conduct, and it really gives immigrants a bad name when a man acts as Humza Yousaf does and says the ridiculous things he says. I'm afraid that the racism exists, certainly, but it's racism against white people, who are increasingly a minority in that country, generally, if not in Scotland. But it's absolutely absurd. And the censorship which comes with it, if you look at what the Prime Minister is saying, he's saying he gets to label things however he wishes, he gets to express his own opinion, but the average person dare not do so, even if just sharing a post on social media. Well, I would say that kind of censorship is the son of fear, and certainly the father of ignorance. And when you have a government that fears what its people might say, or better yet, what they might reveal, the obvious, for example, in Scotland, with Humza Yousaf and this ridiculous complaining and syndrome he has, then it's really a government which fears its own people. But that culture in the UK goes back a long way. It really goes back at least to World War I with their Ministry of Information, which they probably didn't call it the Ministry of Truth because it just obviously wouldn't look very good, but it effectively was the same thing, and it continued into World War II, and essentially what they did is they engaged in censorship of what their population could and could not see, as if they were treating them like children. And they engaged in the production of movies and documentaries, which are purely propaganda. And if you look at what's going on to this day, even if the Ministry of Information doesn't exist and it's still in its form it did in the 1940s, it certainly is a part of the British culture. And I would say that the UK is a canary in the coal mine, although this is also happening in the United States with censorship. And what we stand to lose is extraordinary. And the complaints which are taking place in the UK, which has this extraordinarily diverse ethnic population, they've opened their doors, it's basically free immigration like Belgium. It's extraordinary, right? It's probably the least racist country in the world. And yet we don't complain when we say, well, geez, how many white Christian ministers do we have in the Chinese government? Or actually, better yet, how many white Christian ministers or politicians exist in Muslim countries or in Arab countries or in African ones. But I guess their ideas about diversity and inclusion and equity only apply to Western Europe. So if there is a telltale sign that they are in fact the true racists, it's that right there. That I guess what their ideas about diversity and minorities and racism apparently only applies to Western Europe and Northwest Europe and the UK, because nobody seems to be complaining about Pakistan. We don't have white ministers in Pakistan. We don't have Christian ministers in Pakistan. Actually, they're actively killing Christians. They're persecuting them. Hamza Youssef should get a grip, and he should take a look at his own country, because even though he'd like to say he's Scottish, he was born in Scotland, actually, if you look at his family pictures and his extended family pictures, they present as Punjabi Muslims from Pakistan, because that is their roots. He is first generation. It is inseparable, and that is a good thing. He should respect his roots, just as the Scottish people would like to respect their roots, and the British people and so forth would like to respect their cultural and religious heritage. But this is absolute absurdity. And what you find in a society like this, when we're really, butting up against Marxism, neo-Marxism, and a desire to control the populace through censorship, is you're taking something true and you're inverting it, and you're calling it exactly what it's not. By calling them racist, a country that diverse, it is an absurdity. Look at the homogeneous nature of the Middle Eastern countries. Look at Saudi Arabia. Look at Pakistan. Look at all of these countries in the Middle East. Those are countries where you can say there's very little tolerance for something outside of its own people, its own homogeneia, as we say in Greek. But to call the UK that is purely absurd. It's really to incite greater violence. It's to incite greater discord. It's to incite greater disharmony amongst the people by calling them what they're not.
The police will be making arrests, individuals will be held on remand, charges will follow, and convictions will follow. I guarantee you will regret taking part in this disorder.
Population replacement is not a theory, much less a conspiracy theory. It's actually a quote-unquote solution proposed by the United Nations in a March 2000 report. And of course, the native population of Europe is concerned about this. Are the Muslim immigrants to blame? I don't think so. I think first and foremost, we are to blame, the Western European and American population, which has turned our back on our own culture. As I said before, that a tree without roots is a dead tree. In the same way, a person who has no cultural roots, who has no religious roots, is a person who is dead. And of course, if there's any question about that, look at what the Europeans are doing to themselves. They've turned inward so much through hedonism and narcissism that they're literally killing themselves at a rate which is extraordinary. As far as I know, no Muslims in Europe have signed up for euthanasia. Why are the Europeans checking out? And look at the reproductive problems. Look at the infertility problems. Look at Greece. Look at Bulgaria. Look at the UK. The population is declining dramatically because they simply aren't reproducing. Why? They don't love marriage and family life anymore. They don't care for the love of a child, which is so extraordinary. What do they care for? The self. They are self-absorbed. It is a self-absorbed, materialistic, ultra-materialistic society. And there's no coincidence that they are also have turned their back and become apostates. That they've walked away from Christ, turned their back on their churches, turned their churches into restaurants and pubs and hotels and every other thing they can think of to defile what is sacred. And of course, the immigrants, say what you will of them, and their religion leaves a lot to be desired, but at least they love their religion. They love their culture. Can we say the same thing for the native European population, for the Americans? I don't think so. So there is a sort of reversal of roles. There has become a hyper-racism towards the white Christian remnants of European population and the United States population. But that is really brought on themselves, because if you knew and loved your roots, if you knew and loved where you came from, if you knew anything about the magnificent Christian society, culture, and civilization which built Europe, which the immigrants come in and enjoy quite a lot, right? There's a wonderful infrastructure, beautiful architecture, beauty everywhere they turn. If you knew something about that, you would actually love and embrace with piety your roots and your ancestors, instead of hating where you come from to the extent where you do not even see meaning in life. A complete vacuum, a virtual spiritual vacuum which leads to death. When a person, a young person in their 20s, feels depressed or feels stress or something, feels that they simply cannot live any longer, that they have to commit euthanasia, and this is increasing hundreds of %, When you look at Canada and they're actively burning down their churches, a formerly Christian country, right? Burning down, they burn down 75 churches, and 4.1% of the deaths are attributed to, well, we'll call it doctor murder, right? Physicians to suicide sounds much more politically correct, but let's be honest. The doctor is committing murder and the patient is committing suicide. When that's occurring, what do you expect to happen in terms of an exchange of populations? And I'd say, look at the people who are without passion, right? The human passions. Look at Klaus Schwab, look at Yuval Harari, and look at their ideas about a post-human world. It's as if they see humanity itself as a plague, and almost certainly see white humanity as plague. Look at their faces. They don't have hatred. And of course they don't have hatred because they don't first have love. You can only hate if you first experience love. And your love will only turn to hate when you don't know God's love. Because if you knew God's love, if you knew the self-sacrificial love of Christ, your Lord, your love would never turn into hate. It would become a cross that you could bear, and you would love your neighbor even if they didn't know Christ. Rediscover your Christian roots, go back to church, take up your cross, and your young Muslim brothers and sisters, your neighbors, will appear different in your eyes. They're not really the ones creating this disharmony. They're not really the ones destroying the country. The country is being destroyed from within because there are actors from without who want its destruction. These are people who believe in a post-human existence. You know, they say that you can tell the kind of life a person has lived by looking in their face, by looking in their eyes. Look in your neighbor's face and look in their eyes. You'll see a hardworking person who wants a better life for themselves and for their children. Hatred is a prison that your heart lives in. You don't harm the other by hating them. You only harm yourself. And you're probably taking years off your own life. If you return to a life in Christ, if you return to church, if you return to communion with God, that love in your heart will be restored. The hatred you might feel will be healed. And you will live in a life of example that even your neighbor will learn from, because peace is infectious. Nobody wants hatred. Nobody wants violence. Nobody wants chaos. If you want to know where the real harmful elements in the world are, don't look at those whose veins are pulsing with blood, who are perhaps misguided, who have the dashed hopes, the dashed sense of love that is turned into frustration and turned into hatred. Look at those who are cold and indifferent. It's not so much that they don't feel love or hate, it's that they're already dead. They are physically alive, but in every other sense, spiritually, their soul has departed this life and not to a nice place. And that is the real enemy. It is spiritual death, not physical death. So I would say, if you look at your neighbor, wherever he is from, he is there now. He's not going to be leaving the country. For that person, they should respect the cultural and religious heritage of the country. They shouldn't seek to overtake what exists there, churches, Christendom, Christianity, and the cultural heritage of Christianity. But at the same time, if those native populations of Scotland, of the UK, of Western Europe re-embrace their own cultural heritage, if they return to church, if they return to Christ, they will not see their neighbors as enemies. They will see them as their brothers and sisters, at least in humanity. And when you live a life in Christ, you cannot hate, because that is not the way of a Christian. And it is the only way forward to sanity.